Yes, Your Honor.
Be seated.
I'm going to ask that you do a brief proffer on Mr. Boccio, Sergeant Boccio testimony regarding this tape because of what it is a 37-long audio where there's one line that can be heard. That's the one that you will testify to. I understand that, but there's nothing audible on there that puts it in any kind of context in any way, shape, or form, absent the testimony and prior foundation being made by Gregory Washington, which we don't have, which we had last time. But because of such a brief, again, there's one line that's being heard out of this entire context that takes it out of context, and I believe at this point it's probative outweighs.
Let's have a jury. We don't need a proffer. Boccio.
All right, y'all ready? All rise for the jury.
Please, note the witness, if you would face the clerk and be sworn, please.
You swear affirm the testimony you have given this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but truth, so help you God.
I do.
All right, have a seat. Slide up to the railing, please. May proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sergeant Boccio, can you spell your first and last name for the court reporter?
My name is Vincent, V as in Victor, I-N-C-E-N-T. Last name Boccio, B as in boy, O-C-C-I-O.
And you're employed by Tallahassee Police Department, right?
That's correct.
What were you doing for TPD back in 2010?
I was assigned to the homicide unit.
Okay. And now you're a sergeant, correct?
Lieutenant.
A lieutenant. See, I was right. So you're a lieutenant now, so you oversee divisions within TPD. You don't do the investigation yourself now.
That's correct. I'm a patrol watch commander at nighttime.
Okay. Back in 2010, what role did you play in this case?
I was a support investigator. Again, I was assigned to the homicide unit. The primary investigator gets assigned the case, and then we are tasked with many jobs, and we help out with interviews, collecting evidence, and everything like that.
Okay. So Mark Lewis was the lead investigator, right?
That's correct.
And so you and other homicide investigators were providing support, correct?
Yes.
All right. At some point, did you decide to investigate a potential target named Demario Paramore and also Haywood Griffin?
That's correct.
And what investigative steps did you take to that end?
We gathered information that...
Don't go into what you gathered, please.
Okay. The two individuals were a target of our investigation for having participated in the homicide. And we conducted a search warrant on their residence and ultimately were able to interview them.
Okay. And in order to facilitate collection of evidence, did you at some point document a confidential informant?
I did.
Okay. And affixed the confidential informant with a wire?
Yes.
And sent him out into the community under your supervision to talk to Demario Paramore, right?
That's correct.
So when he had these interaction with Demario Paramore, he was wearing your wire and you could listen to what he was saying, correct?
Yes.
You could hear both Mr. Paramore and the confidential informant?
Correct.
Okay. While the confidential informant was talking to Mr. Paramore, did Mr. Paramore allude to the fact that he had some participation in the murders of Brandy Peters and her children?
He did make a statement, yes.
Okay. And during the same conversation with the confidential informant, Mr. Paramore explained the reason for killing the children as you don't leave any witnesses, dead men don't talk, correct?
That's what he said.
Okay. So you indicated that Mr. Paramore and Mr. Griffin were subsequently arrested once y'all executed search warrants, right?
Yes.
And ultimately they ended up getting arrested, indicted on other stuff not related to this murder, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you did a custodial interview with Mr. Paramore, correct?
I sustain the hearsay objection at this point.
As the statements made by
Yes.
Mr. Paramore? Okay. I'm going to ask you about some follow-up investigation and I don't want to go into what Mr. Paramore actually said, okay?
Okay.
Were you provided alibi witnesses for,
Reject that calls to be overruled.
were you provided names of alibi witnesses that could place Mr. Paramore away from the murders during the time when that happened?
Yes.
Okay. And were you provided some information about a cell phone that Mr. Paramore was using at the time?
Correct.
Okay. And ultimately, did you get a buccal swab from Mr. Paramore?
Yes.
Okay. Now, following your interview with Mr. Paramore, did you follow up by going and doing interviews with any of those listed or named alibi witnesses?
He provided his wife and child.
Okay.
So unfortunately, no, we did not.
Okay. And as far as the buccal swab goes, well, let me just clarify this. You talked to him in March of 2011, is that right?
That's correct.
And the buccal swab wasn't ultimately sent off to FDLE until 2016, right?
That's correct.
And that was following me kind of giving you a hard time at a deposition about not having followed up on that investigative lead, correct?
It was done after the deposition, yes.
Right. Similarly, with respect to Mr. Paramore's cell phone or potential cell phone information, that was something that ended up not getting passed along to Sergeant Corbett, right? So no records were ever requested during the investigative phase of the case for Mr. Paramore?
On his current cell phone that he was using, yes, court orders were done on that cell phone.
Subsequent to this, right?
Correct.
Okay. Is the reason that you didn't follow up on those investigative leads, talking to alibi witnesses or sending off a buccal swab to FDLE or getting phone records contemporaneous with your investigation into these murders, that you basically felt that Mr. Paramore was full of it as it pertained to his confession?
After the interview with Mr. Paramore, it was evident through the cooperation and things that he provided that he was not the person that we were looking at.
So yes, without any corroboration, you basically just had a feeling that he was full of it when he confessed. Is that fair to say?
No. Again, we did corroborate a lot of evidence through cell phone records. There was plenty of court orders done, including his girlfriend's, everyone that was on Brandy Peters' cell phone. So all those cell sites and court orders, they were done prior to. That's the reason why, at the end of the interview, that we decided that he was not our main suspect.
Cooperation, not that you felt he was full of it? That he was cooperative, I mean to say, not that you personally felt he was full of it.
He was cooperative, that's correct.
Okay. Do you recall in your deposition being asked, so if his DNA, which you provided, is never compared to exclude him as a witness, and his cell phone data is never obtained to exclude him as a witness, and none of his alibi witnesses are ever questioned to exclude him as a witness, how is he so easily dismissed after having confessed? And if it's just as simple as you've been doing this forever and you could tell based on your interview that he was obviously full of it, that's fine. I just want to know how he was so easily, and you interrupted and said, yeah. I said, that's pretty much it. And you said, that pretty much sums it up. You recall that?
Yes.
So it was essentially based on the fact that you simply felt he was full of it, correct?
The totality of the circumstances, yes.
Thank you. No further questions for witness.
Right.
Let's talk about this alleged confession. First and foremost, who was it that said that he allegedly confessed? The person that you wired up?
Who the confidential informant was?
Yeah.
It was Gregory Washington.
Gregory Washington. You have a history with Gregory Washington, do you not?
Yes.
And is that a good history?
No.
Not from arrest and everything like that as a confidential informant. He's been proven to be unreliable, has he not?
That is correct.
And in fact, the only reason that he was utilizing this is because we're investigating the homicide of 3 children and Brandy Peters, correct?
Yes.
So took extraordinary measures and using a confidential informant that we normally wouldn't do, correct?
That is correct.
In this particular case, Gregory Washington.
Yes.
Okay. As I said, Gregory Washington isn't known for his, in the law enforcement community, utilizing him as a confidential informant. He's not one we would normally use because of his unreliability. That's correct?
That's correct.
In this audio recording that we're talking about, it's actually 37 minutes long, is it not?
Yes.
And you're able to hear and monitor along those things, along the lines, correct?
Yes.
Isn't it true that you really couldn't hear anything other than Greg Washington talking for almost the entirety of the, and quite frankly, badgering Mr. Paramore?
He was definitely pushing the conversation, but yes, he monopolized almost the entire time.
Okay. And eventually, Mr. Paramore basically just says the kids were killed because dead men don't talk.
Yes.
Okay. I think we can agree that is why the children were killed, because that way they could not witness who actually killed, correct?
I agree. Yes.
So what he's saying isn't, in fact, inaccurate facts, correct?
That's correct.
Nothing along that audio in any way, shape, or form did Mr. Paramore say that he was the one that did the killing.
That's correct.
Okay. And in fact, once again, Mr. Washington is the only one that even remotely got this thing started in the first place.
Yes, sir.
1 moment. When we talk about Mr. Washington being unreliable, isn't it true that, quite frankly, me at the state attorney's office forbid him to be used as a confidential informant because of his unreliability?
That's also correct.
And you and Mr. Campbell actually came to me and asked permission to use him once again despite that order, correct?
That is correct.
And we again made the exception because of the fact that we're talking about the deaths of 3 children and Miss Peters.
Yes, sir.
And again, you said the totality of the circumstances, including the cooperation of Mr. Paramore, eliminated him as suspect.
Yes.
Cell phone records eliminated him and Griffin. There was no communication between them and Brandy Peters' cell phone, correct?
Correct.
Nothing that could be determined that they would have any kind of grudge against or motive for Miss Peters' murder or the children's murder for that matter.
That's correct.
Okay. And that buccal swab was in fact gotten.
Yes.
Many years later, it was gotten.
Yes.
And actually he's come back as not present, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. No further questions. Redirect.
I want to clarify a couple of things. So you said his buccal swab was sent off to FDLE following your deposition, and isn't it true that the profile developed from his buccal swab was only compared to, I think, one of the hundreds of evidentiary exhibits? Is that right?
I have no idea on that part.
Fair enough. I want to ask you specifically because although the audio is inaudible, you could actually hear what was being said throughout the entire interaction between confidential informant and target, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so when Mr. Fuchs asked you a minute ago, there wasn't any statement specifying that Mr. Paramore was involved, that wasn't accurate, correct? Mr. Paramore specifically alluded to the fact that he had some participation in the murders. Is that true?
Again, he didn't say he, but he did end up saying that statement that we talked about.
You wrote a police report, right?
Yes.
Do you recall writing in your police report, Paramore alluded to the fact that he had some participation in these murders?
Based on the statement, yes, sir.
Right, that's what I was asking.
Okay, but yeah.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you decided to use Gregory Washington, notwithstanding the fact that he's generally unreliable?
Yeah, because of the crime that happened and how Mr. Fuchs just said, we're talking about 3 kids and a mother that was murdered here. We wanted to make sure that we used every possible resource at our disposal, and we wanted to make sure that we covered everything so we can make sure that we could confirm or deny who the main suspect is. And in fact, in the end, we ended up doing that.
Okay. Part of the way that you were able to deal with Mr. Washington's established unreliability is having him on the wire so that you could hear what was being said, right?
That's correct.
So you didn't have to rely on Mr. Washington's assertions. You could hear for yourself what was being said.
Yes.
May we approach real quick? No further questions for the witness.
All right. Juror, have a question of this witness. All right. right, you may step down.
Thank you.
We need to keep the thing first.
Yes, Your Honor.
Remain under rule, please.
Yes, sir.
Your next witness.
Yeah, at this time, Your Honor, the defense would call John Sawicki.
We better go sidebar. If you take some work and be sworn, please.
Swear affirm testimony about giving this case to be the truth, whole truth, and nothing but truth, so help you God.
I do.
Have a seat, slide up the rail, please.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Sawicki, can you please state your name and spell both your first and last name for the court report?
John Sawicki, John Sawicki.
And what do you do for a living?
I am a forensic computer scientist and electronic evidence consultant.
What does that mean exactly?
Essentially what that means is I dig through electronic devices, computers, cell phones, cell phone records, attempt to determine what the user's done with the device, document what I find, prepare to testify about it later.
And to be able to do that, did you have to undergo any specialized education or training?
I did.
Tell us about that.
I have a law degree from Florida State University. I have a master's degree in digital forensics from the University of Central Florida. I've got a graduate certificate in computer forensics from the University of Central Florida. I've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 or 700 hours of specialized training in computer and cell phone forensics, interpreting call detail records, general training in how cell tower networks operate from a variety of different providers, generally private sector companies that provide either hardware or software packages to law enforcement and to corporate entities. I've also done graduate level coursework in the area of radio frequency engineering through the University of California, San Diego's extension program.
Okay. And have you previously been qualified to testify as an expert as it pertains to interpretation of call detail records and other records of the same sort?
I have, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 or 70 times in state and federal court across the country.
Okay. Are you also a bar attorney?
I am. I'm admitted to practice law in the state of Florida.
I guess I should clarify. When I say barred, I don't mean prohibited. I mean you're a member of the bar. Is that right?
It is. That's correct.
Okay. Have you likewise written peer-reviewed articles?
I don't know that any of my articles have actually been peer-reviewed. I've certainly written articles that have been published in legal journals, but I don't think any of them have actually gone through the peer review process.
Okay. Your Honor, at this point, I would tender the witness.
Any word out?
There.
All right, you may proceed.
I want to just ask you about any analysis that you would have done in this case relative to Mr. Segura's 408 number, 850-408 number, during the afternoon and evening hours of November 19th, 2010.
Yes, sir. That would have been the 8669 number?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
And did you have an opportunity to review all of Mr. Segura's records for that phone during that time frame?
I did review the call detail report, the RTT report. Yes, sir.
Tell the jury what each of those things are.
Sure. When you get records from a cell phone carrier, you typically get a number of documents that are fairly similar across all the carriers, but not necessarily identical. The call detail report is a pretty standard report, though they're not necessarily identical from carrier to carrier. It'll usually contain an event-by-event listing of the phone calls, potentially text messages, potentially data transmissions, the dates and times of those events, the details of who is contacting who, that is by phone number, for those particular events for whatever period the report is collected for. The RTT report is much more of an engineering-focused report, has a lot of engineering details to it, but some of the more important ones that you've kind of heard about a little bit in this case are let me take a step back. RTT stands for round-trip timing. So one of the more important pieces of that is a component that attempts to establish the range to tower distance for different events as they transpire. I believe that's the two reports that we discussed.
Okay. And in reviewing those records, did you also review the records compiled by the Tallahassee Police Department as it relates to the dummy phone, the duplicate phone that they used to try and establish distance to tower error ranges?
Yeah, this was a sample phone that the Tallahassee Police Department went out and purchased and made a series of phone calls, text messages, data transmissions, and I did have a chance to review the RTT report for that phone as well.
Okay. And based on your review of all the records, were you able to draw any conclusions as it pertains to the distance to tower information pertaining to the sector information pertaining to Mr. Segura's 408 phone?
I mean, you can draw a number of conclusions about the data itself and to the interpretation of that data.
Okay. And I guess let me ask you about the process utilized by the Tallahassee Police Department to try and determine error range. Well, I guess let me back up and ask this. Why was the distance to tower data accumulated in the first place by the various carriers? What was the science behind that, and what's the purpose behind that?
So the science behind that data is essentially around a range timing function. If you're familiar with time, rate, distance calculations, you know that if you're going to drive from here to Jacksonville, that it should take you about 3 hours if you drive at 60 miles an hour. You can do that function and determine about how far it is if you've got all three numbers, time, rate, and distance. It's a very similar calculation that the carriers use when they're trying to determine the range to tower distance in how long it takes a signal to go from the handset, from the tower to the handset back to the tower. And there are a number of factors that can certainly impact that, but you can calculate out how long that should take, and it works pretty well until, like in the vehicle idea, how long it'd take you to drive to Jacksonville, somebody has to stop to go to the bathroom, or you have to get gas or something like that. Something gets in the way of that calculation and causes it to be off a little bit. Well, the same thing happens in the phones, in that you can have a number of different things happen within the transmission from the tower to the phone and back. You can have something called reflection or refraction, which causes the signal to take a variety of different paths from the tower to the phone and throws off that timing. You can have a latency effect within the device itself, how long it takes that signal once it receives it for it to send that signal back to the tower. And so that can throw off that timing distance. And as we saw, the range to tower distance is pretty much never exactly correct.
Okay. And in general, what kind of error range are we talking about?
So it really just kind of depends I believe the Tallahassee Police Department made somewhere around 60, created somewhere around 60 events, and that would be phone calls, text messages, data transmissions, in an attempt to recreate what they thought had transpired with the phone. And in all of those transmissions, I believe that there were about 88% of them that were off by more than 1/10 of a mile. And in some cases, they're off by as much as 1.5 miles or even a little bit more than that.
Okay. Did you walk through each of the communications between, say, 13:41 or 1:41 p.m. and the 8:21 communication for Mr. Segura's 408 phone number?
I did.
Okay. And did you develop maps to use to demonstrate to the jury which towers and which sectors his phone was communicating with during that time frame?
I did.
All right. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
For identification, this is going to be defense composite exhibit 5A through 5U. Do you recognize that?
Those are the maps I developed.
And can you look through and tell me whether they're a true and accurate depiction of the maps you developed?
They do appear to be.
Okay. At this time, Your Honor, I would request to move into evidence with print pre-mark as defense composite exhibit 5A through 5U into evidence as defense
Any
composite.
objection? No. Be admitted.
Request permission to publish, Your Honor.
You may.
First, let's talk about the communication which took place from Mr. Segura's 408 phone at 13:41:08. This is 5A. What does this map depict?
So this shows, number one, the two locations that were of concern when I was doing this analysis. 908 Saddle Creek Run, which, as we know, where the incident occurred. 401 Gale Avenue, which I believe is Mr. Segura's sister's residence. And I can't quite read the upper left-hand corner. It's got some information up there that includes the range to tower distance. From Tower 847, there's a dark line right through the middle of that cell sector, and that is the range to tower distance that was reported in the RTT report.
So what does the blue arc represent?
There's actually, and unfortunately this doesn't show up very well on the overhead, but there's actually two blue arcs within there. You've got a smaller blue arc that appears immediately around that range to tower line, and then you have a broader blue section through the sector that is a little wider there. The narrow section reflects the average range to tower deviation, which I believe was somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.20 miles. For this sector, 847, this is a long, the second part of that is a longer error range, which reflects the greater deviation that we were seeing amongst that data of 0.61 miles, plus or minus.
And we actually saw instances in looking at the communications from Mr. Segura's phone, which would indicate there was quite a bit of deviation over short periods of time, correct? Specifically, I'll refer to the two communications which occurred 7 seconds apart at 7:23 p.m., just as an example. How far was the reported distance deviated between those two 7-second apart communications?
I'm actually going to have to check the records to refer to that. I don't remember the exact distance, but it was a little over miles, I recall.
Okay. So, needless to say, it's impossible that the handset traveled that amount of distance in that amount of time.
Yeah, I recall that we checked the speed it would require to move that distance, and it was something in the neighborhood of 300 miles an hour.
So, it's safe to say the phone's not traveling that fast. It reflects that there can be, based on, like you say, a variety of factors, significant deviation.
Yeah, it's a system that there are unfortunately other factors that come into play with that signaling information that causes it to be less than precise.
Okay. And this communication that takes place at 13:41:08, which is 1:41 p.m., this arc is depicting Sector 1 from Tower 847, which is down here, correct?
That's correct.
And so if a handset is close to the sector line right here, that's the rough line that separates Sector 1 from Sector 2 for Tower 847, correct?
It's not nearly that neat in practice, but yeah, that is the general area where that handoff is going to happen if you're moving from Sector 1 to Sector 2. In practice, though, I mean, there's really no other way to draw it out theoretically, but in practice, it's not going to be a nice, neat line like that. It's going to be more of a jagged edge.
Based on environmental factors and all kinds of stuff, correct?
That's correct. You're going to have radio frequencies getting blocked by, different things that happen to be in the way. Cars, trucks, houses, hills, any kind of obstacle like that can cause a shadow, essentially. It's not unlike holding a flashlight. Things that come in front of that are going to cause a shadow from the beam, and it's the same with the transmission of energy from the cell tower.
As a general principle, as you go closer to the theoretical sector line right there, you could be in a fixed location, but over multiple communications, the records may reflect that you're jumping between Sector 2 and Sector 1, correct?
Yeah, there's certainly not a hard line there where you're just going to have coverage from Sector 1 and just have coverage from Sector 2. Simply as a matter of a function of how the networks operate, you have to have overlap built in, or when you hit that wall, you're going to drop the call.
Okay. Similarly, if you're closer to the center of a particular sector, your handset is far more likely to only communicate with that particular sector, correct?
As you move towards the center of a sector, you're going to be in the strongest portion of the beam, which I guess is going to make it more likely that you're going to connect with that tower. But I can't say it would only be that tower, except from that. That sector, except from that tower. There certainly are surrounding sectors and towers that could come into play as well.
And just as a general principle, I understand you're saying there's a variety of factors, but as a general principle, your handset will communicate with the sector of a particular tower that is facing the handset, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Based on your calculated error ranges for this communication taking place at 13:41, which is 1:08 p.m. on November 19th, is Mr. Segura's 408 handset at a location consistent with 401 Gale Avenue?
It is.
Okay. Next one is a communication taking place at 1:54 p.m. with Tower 847 at a distance of 1.06 miles. This is 5B. Same kind of map we're looking at there. Is the location of Mr. Segura's 408 handset for that communication likewise consistent with being at 401 Gale Avenue?
It is, yes.
Okay. Next one is at 2:12 p.m. For 14:12 and 48 seconds. Again, for Sector 847, for Tower 847, Sector 1 at a distance of 1.03 miles. And this is 5C. For this map is the reported distance from tower as well as the sector being communicated with, consistent with the handset being at 401 Gale Avenue.
It is, yes.
D is a communication that took place at 2:13 and 37 seconds. It's Tower 847, Sector 1 at a distance of 0.95 miles. Is Mr. Segura's handset for this communication, does it appear to be in a location consistent with 401 Gale Avenue?
It does.
The same question, of course, for a communication, the next one taking place at 2:20 p.m. and 12 seconds, communicating with Tower 847, Sector 1 at a distance of 1.06 miles. According to the records, is the tower, sector, and distance from tower data reported for Mr. Segura's 408 phone consistent with the handset being located at 401 Gale Avenue?
It is.
Again, at 14:27, that's 2:27 and 51 seconds. We're talking about Tower 847 still, Sector 1, 0.93 miles, distance to tower. Is the handset information being reported in the records, does it place the handset at a location consistent with 401 Gale Avenue?
Yes.
And just to be clear, all of these are Sector 1. None of them are line jumping to Sector 2, correct? The ones that we've covered so far.
Correct.
Okay. Great. 5G is the next communication at 15:05, 25 seconds. It's Tower 847, Sector 1 at a distance of 1.04 miles. And again, here is the location reported consistent with 401 Gale Avenue.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Is that that's 3:05 p.m.? Is that right?
It was 15:05, yes, sir.
Okay. And I guess I should ask you this as well. For all of these, we're seeing both 401 Gale Avenue and 908 Saddle Creek Run. Both are showing up in the ARC for all these communications. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
So is there any way to discern whether a handset is located at either one as opposed to the other of these two locations?
Yeah, I don't think you can exclude either one of those.
How about for 1558, still communicating with Sector 1? Is the handset still at a location that is consistent with 401 Gale Avenue as well as 908 Saddle Creek?
Yes, sir.
All right. And I guess I should ask this. Not pictured on this map is another location close to Brandy Peters' house, the church parking lot, right?
That's correct.
That's likewise now, we're talking about it, 1558, that's within this arc as well, correct?
I believe it is, yes, sir.
Next one is at 1757 seconds. This is still Tower 847, Sector 1 at a distance of 1.11 miles. Is the handset location being reported based on the records consistent with either one of those or both of those? I guess is the better way to ask the question. Consistent with either or both of those locations?
Yeah, I believe it is.
As well as the church parking lot as well?
Yes, sir.
And that's 1700 is 5 o'clock, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, next one is at 1745. This is a different tower being communicated with, correct? This is Tower 849
That's correct.
at a distance of 2.54 miles.
Yes, sir.
But the arc looks relatively similar. So both 401 Gale Avenue as well as 908 Saddle Creek as well as the church parking lot are still within the error range for this communication, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. .5K, this is 1801, which is 601, correct?
That's correct.
This is a different tower again, Tower 851, Sector 1, at a distance of 3.98 miles. Any particular reason why a handset would communicate with towers that are farther away?
So if you think about this as we're getting later in the day, what's happening is a lot of people are going home from work, starting to use their phones in their residences rather than in their offices, other places like that. And so for residential neighborhoods, like we may be seeing there, it's putting a heavier load on the towers. For networks like Verizon's, you get an effect that's called cell breathing. And that is the more devices across the tower at a particular time, the less power each of those devices is going to get, so it shortens up that range. So one of the things that could be causing that is you may be seeing that effect for more powerful towers south of town to be filling in when those residential areas, when the towers in those residential areas start to see more volume.
And again, for this communication, both of the locations we're talking about, 401 Gale Avenue and 908 Saddle Creek, they're both within the error range for that tower, right?
Yes, sir.
Right. Next one's at 6:05 p.m. or 18:05. This is it's communicating again now with Tower 847, Sector 1, at a distance of 1.08 miles. And again, we see both of the locations we're talking about depicted on this map are both, again, within the error range.
Yes, sir.
Same question for communication at 6:07 p.m. or 18:07. Both the, well, I guess I should clarify, this is Tower 849, Sector 1 at a distance of 2.52 miles. And again, we see that both the 401 Gale Avenue and 908 Saddle Creek Run locations are within the error range for that communication, that tower, correct?
Yes, sir.
Right. Again, same thing for 6:10 p.m. Communicating with Tower 849 at a distance of 2.51 miles. Both locations are within the error range for the tower.
Yes, sir.
Again, at 6:19. Same thing. Both locations, 401 Gale Avenue and 908, are within the error range for Tower 847, Sector 1.
That's correct.
All right. 6:20 p.m. or 18:20. Again, we're at Tower 847, Sector 1, distance of 1.07 miles. Both locations are still consistent with the reported handset information.
That's correct.
16:25 or 8:25 p.m. Both locations are still consistent with the information reported for the handset.
Yes, sir.
6:33 p.m. This is again Tower 847, Sector 1, at a distance of 1.06 miles. Both locations are still consistent with the information provided for the handset.
Yes, sir.
This is at 19:23 and 42 seconds. So this is 7:23, correct?
Yes, sir.
Tower 847, Sector 1, distance of 1.66 miles. We see in this one, it does not appear that that the Gale Avenue address is any longer within the error range for that tower, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So if he's at either of these locations, it's likely to be Brandy's house at this point, right?
That's correct.
And again, I know that's a big if. He could be anywhere within that arc, right?
That's true.
How about for 7:37 p.m., 847, Sector 1, at a distance of 1.6 miles?
Both
1.06 miles, sorry.
both locations are within the error range.
All right. And now, even at 8:21 p.m., technically, I guess the 401 Gale Avenue address is still within the error range for the tower, right?
It is, though it's very close.
So in situations like this, where there are multiple relevant locations within the error range, can you make any or render any opinion about where specifically the handset is?
I think it's problematic. I mean, that's the issue with the range to tower data anyway, is you have issues with just how accurate it is. And for any particular location to attempt to say, hey, yeah, that's where the phone was, I just don't think we have enough information.
So essentially you agree with Sergeant Corbett that either location could be the location for the handset during any of those communications other than the one noted?
I can't exclude either one.
Okay. Do you also agree with Sergeant Corbett that the 408 handset, once it travels back down to Woodville and is communicating with the tower down in Woodville at 9:30, that handset never goes anywhere near Ms. Peters' house again that day?
That's correct.
Okay. And similarly, his 509 number never goes anywhere near her house either, correct?
Correct.
I have no further questions for the witness.
Yes, sir.
We'll get into the maps in just a second. Are you familiar with the basic scientific principle of conducting experiments?
I am.
Okay. What is that?
Essentially, you would develop a hypothesis, develop an experiment to then test that hypothesis and determine whether or not you have actually created a valid hypothesis based upon those tests.
And you utilize a control, right? With something that you can control and know what the functions are and things along those lines?
That's true.
Okay. In this particular case, when you're analyzing the cell phone data, you analyze the data that was there, correct?
That's true.
Didn't have a control.
The control would have been the TPD test calls.
Okay. So you would agree that that is, in fact, a control?
I think it's a control, albeit with its flaws.
Okay. And in conducting these experiments, you would agree with the principle that Tallahassee Police Department did in placing this phone where they said it was. Sergeant Corbett said it was.
I think it could have been there, yes.
Okay. It is, in fact, consistent with being at her home, right?
That's true.
Okay. Now, you're paid by the fence, right? You were hired by the fence?
Yes, sir.
And you were initially hired, when were you initially hired?
It's been a little while. I would have to say it was probably early in 2017.
Hired early in 2017?
Yes, sir.
And you were asked to go back and take a look at the information that was provided to the fence regarding the cell phone information for accuracies, discrepancies, things along those lines, correct?
That's true.
And in making those findings, as you've reported today, you can find no faults really with what Tallahassee Police Department found, correct?
I don't think my issue would be with the findings. I think it would be the limitations upon those findings and just how firmly you can agree to that conclusion.
What do you mean?
What I mean by that is we had a very limited sample size of approximately 60 phone calls off of the test device over a fairly short period of time. And while it gives us an idea that, yeah, that could be correct, it's really not enough to validate the actual phone calls in order to determine, hey, yeah, this is how that's going to react in every circumstance, particularly given some of the unpredictability of the cell tower networks.
Okay. But you just got through testifying that your findings are consistent with what Sergeant Corbett testified to, correct?
I think there are findings that are, the findings are correct. However, we have to acknowledge the limitations.
And that limitations is that Gale Street address could also be included in this cone that you utilize, correct?
That's true, and we don't know for sure where the phone is at for range to tower distance when you've got those limitations to the test calls that were actually made.
Okay. But the test calls indicated what they did, and the data indicated what it was, and it was all consistent with being at Brandy Peters' home, correct?
Sure. In that limited testing, that's correct.
Okay. And you would have reported that back to the fence, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But you would agree with me that when you did that reporting back to the fence, that it certainly showed that he was not at 1098 Mustang Drive where he told law enforcement he was.
I don't know where he was at. All I can do is tell you where the phone is at, but I would agree that the phone was not at 1098 Mustang Drive.
Let's take a look here. $1:41 in the afternoon, not at 1048 Mustang Drive.
Yes, sir.
1:54 in the afternoon, not at 1098 Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
1:12. I'm sorry, am I right? No, 2:12, excuse me. Not at 1098 Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
2:13, not at 1098 Mustang Drive.
That's true.
10:20, not at 1098 Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
2:27, not at 1098 Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
3:05, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
3:58, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
5 o'clock, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
5:45, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
6 o'clock, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
6:05, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
6:07, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
6:10, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
6:19, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
6:20, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
Got hung up here a little bit. And 6:25, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
6:33, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
7:23, not at Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
7:23, consistent with 908 Saddle Creek Run.
That's true.
7:23, when Mrs. Peters' phone stops communicating in an active way at 908 Saddle Creek Run,
Correct.
and not at 1098 Mustang Drive.
That's correct.
7:37, again, when Miss Peters' phone is not communicating and not being used actively at 908 Saddle Creek Run and not at 1098 Mustang Drive.
And potentially at 401 Gale, but yes, that's correct.
And at 8:21, when Miss Peters' phone is no longer communicating with any network in any way, shape, or form and never to be heard from again, not at 1098 Mustang Drive and consistent with Saddle Creek Run.
And potentially Gale Avenue, yes, sir.
So you would agree with me then, Mrs. Segura was there when Brandy at 908 Saddle Creek Run, when Miss Peters' phone stopped communicating with the tower.
I would say the phone could potentially be there, yes, sir.
Redirect.
This is probably a long, boring, and redundant way to say something very simple, which lawyers like me and Mr. Fuchs tend to do. You and Sergeant Corbett agree. You can't definitively say where the phone is at within the error arc during all of these communications, right?
That's correct.
The handset location could be consistent either with 401 Gale Avenue or 908, with the exception of the one at 737, I think it was, correct?
Correct.
723.
Yes, sir.
And at that time, we know Mr. Segura was at Ms. Peters' house because he's testified to that, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And again, with regard to Sergeant Corbett's testimony that the handset stayed down in Woodville for the rest of the night after it got back down there at 9:30, you agreed with that as well?
Yes, sir.
All right. So in this case, although there may have been some issues with the scientific methodology that they utilized to try and come up with an error range, it ended up not mattering because everybody agrees, all the experts agree, you and Sergeant Corbett, that neither location can be excluded for most of these communications.
That's correct.
Thank you. No further questions.
Did you ever have a question of this witness? All right, you can step down. Be a good place to break for the evening. Persuade y'all to go home.
Have a good evening. Don't talk with anybody about the case. Don't let anybody talk with you about the case. 8:45 tomorrow morning. See you.
We're about on pace, I think. We were going slow for a while, but I think I made up ground, and we'll still be on pace to finish either by the end of the day tomorrow or very early Friday. Mr. Fuchs has indicated he thinks he can finish with his rebuttal Friday as well, which he and I have been talking about it throughout the trial, and I think what we're both hoping for is that we'll be done with his rebuttal case by the end of the day Friday. I'll need to put Mr. Knox on, and he'll need to put Mr. Yao on Monday. I don't think that'll take a full day, and we would be ready to close. I'm going to request, I can't speak for Mr. Fuchs, but I'm going to request that we close Tuesday. That's kind of the track that we're planning.
Fuchs, are we ready to close on your arm too?
Yeah, but I don't want to give it to them late in the day. I'd hope that we could I don't know. I've not done it where we broke out the closings from the instructions. So probably what we choose to do is start one morning, and if Tuesday works, that would be good, with instructions and closing, and send it to them that way. So let's keep working to that. Tuesday would work okay. So I think jury would be good with that. Anything else?
No.
All right. See y'all at 8:30.